Hey Sugar Geeks, Liz here. This week, I'm gonna show you guys how to make your very own homemade brioche bread. Don't be intimidated. It's not too tricky. There's just a few key points you need to remember, and I'm gonna teach you everything coming up next in the Sugar Geek Show. Brioche bread is a delicious, rich, buttery, soft, fluffy, basically heaven in a loaf. It's no wonder that it is one of the most classic pastries and high-end breads that you can get. It's a little bit different than your typical bread. We're not gonna knead it by hand like you normally would. But the good news is the mixer does all of the work. The other thing that's a little bit different is that we have to let this dough rest for a minimum of 2 hours up to 2 days. So it's really flexible. You can make it really far in advance, or you can just make it a couple hours in advance. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're gonna do is make our sponge. So we're gonna mix our yeast in with our milk about 80 degrees, and then we're gonna mix in some bread flour and let that rise until it doubles. Depending on how warm the room is, it could take anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. I put mine in my toaster oven because it has a proofing stage, or you could put it in your oven with the light on, but just wanna do that until it doubles. This is gonna give our yeast a head start on growing because we have so much eggs and butter. Yeast doesn't really like to eat eggs and butter. I mean, it tastes delicious in bread, don't get me wrong, but yeast likes flour. It likes the starch. You can use active dry yeast, which is like your regular generic yeast that you would find at the grocery store. It's just gonna take twice as long for it to actually rise. And since this already kind of takes a little bit longer to rise because we're using a rich dough, which slows the yeast down, you wanna use instant yeast so it's gonna not take quite so long, right? Then we're gonna add that sponge to our mixer and we're gonna start adding in our eggs. We wanna mix the eggs, make sure they're room temperature, one at a time until they're fully combined and before you add in the next one. And that's gonna, get all nice and beautiful and smooth. Now we can add in more bread flour, our sugar, and then our salt. Now we're gonna switch to the dough hook. Let that mix for 5 minutes. Now I did this 2 ways. One time I did it on my Brioche and it was not mixing right and I had to add a little bit of extra water so that it was sticking correctly. But then I did it a second time in my KitchenAid and it mixed just fine. So I don't know what the difference was. Maybe it's just the different bowl shapes. So keep in mind, if it seems too dry, you can add an extra tablespoon of water to get it mixing. You can use all-purpose flour if you don't have bread flour. What's gonna happen though is that the bread is just not gonna rise as much and it's not gonna be as chewy. And the reason is because bread flour literally has more protein and more gluten in it than all-purpose flour. So it's really, gluten's good for bread. That's why you can't make bread out of cake flour. It's mostly starch and with a little bit of protein, and bread flour is a lot of protein and a little bit of starch. So the type of flour you use does make a difference, but it's not gonna make or break it. You can use all purpose if that's all you have. Okay, so this is looking good now. Starting to develop those strands of gluten. They're getting stretchier like so, but they're still not super smooth. You wanna make sure that you do this mixing because we're developing this strong network of gluten. When you add liquid to flour, that's what activates the gluten, and then as we mix it, it makes it stronger and stronger. And people always ask, can I over mix the bread? And the answer is you could, but your mixer would probably burn up first. After that's been mixing for 5 minutes, we're gonna go ahead and start adding in our butter. Literally so much butter. This is not diet bread. There's a reason why. This is a high-end, expensive bread. It's got lots of butter in it, and butter is expensive. We're gonna just start adding that in one piece at a time, let it incorporate, and then, once it's all mixed in there, we're gonna let this continue mixing with the dough hook for 15 minutes. Even 20 if you have to. It's gonna go from this kind of rough, textured looking piece of dough to super silky smooth. And that's when we know we have developed enough gluten. The structure is strong enough. It's gonna trap all of those yummy air bubbles from the yeast doing its thing, and it's gonna be ready to rest. Look at that. It is incredibly soft and delicate looking. Look how much stretch. Yeah, I'd say it's done. Now we're gonna let this dough just hang out in a warm spot. It could be the same place that you let the sponge rise for about 30 minutes just to kind of make sure that the yeast is going and growing. And even though it's sticky, it is really only sticking to itself. Like it's not really sticking to the table. I don't even have any flour on there or anything, but it is wet for sure. Okay, into a buttered bowl for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to refrigerate it for 2 hours or up to 2 days. This is where we have our flexibility. If you are making this bread for like, you know, a big holiday coming up, you're making a big batch of it, make it ahead. It's just gonna taste more and more delicious the longer you leave it in the fridge. Or if you need bread like right now, I don't blame you. Just chill it long enough that you can handle the dough. In fact, I've even read that you can put it in the freezer for like an hour if you really need to rush it. So if you do that, put it in the freezer just to the point where you can handle it, then you shape it. The trick though is after that, you have to let it rise until it doubles. You don't want to rush that because otherwise the texture of the bread is going to be kind of like not so good. So make sure that it is fully risen to the point where you press it with your finger and it leaves an indentation, or it just like slowly bounces back to the halfway point. If it springs back right away, definitely needs to be rising for longer. Okay, so we have dough that is been chilled and is ready to go. Look at this big baby. It's a lot of dough. It's all poofy and happy. Ah. So you see it's a lot easier to handle. It's nice and smooth. It's very buttery. So now we get to do shaping, and that's fun. Okay, flour. All right, we're gonna dust it. I'm gonna weigh my actual pieces. All right, so I just kind of shaped it into like a little square just so that I can kind of get a sense of dividing this evenly. Like that. It cuts so nicely because of all of the butter, right? Ooh, satisfying. So this one's 8 ounces. 8.4, 7.3, wah wah. You don't think 1 ounce of bread is a lot until you actually see it. Like, that's a big difference. So you should have exactly 8 ounces for each one. We're doing the classic 3-strand braid and baking that up in a 5" by 9" non-stick metal pan, but you can do so many things with this. You can use classic brioche tins. You can bake it straight on a sheet pan with parchment paper, just like make a classic loaf. You can do a double batch of brioche dough and make a ring and like add some like glaze and some like nuts on top and make it for a holiday, make it a little bit sweeter. Or you can fold in shredded cheese and ham and make them into dinner rolls. There's so many options. So I am using a 5" by 9" non-stick bread pan, but you can use a cake pan, you can make it in a glass pan. If it's not non-stick though, you want to make sure that you butter it or use cake goop so that it comes out of the pan. And we're going to roll these out. They roll really easily. A little bit longer than the length of the pan. If you see any big bubbles, just pop them. A little bit longer, maybe like a 1.5. It's pretty cold down here, I would say, right? I imagine if you were in a really warm room, this would get very challenging quickly because your butter starts to melt, right? So if these start getting too sticky and you can't handle them well enough, you can put them back in the fridge or even the freezer to get that butter firmed up again. Okay, now we're gonna braid. So we're gonna pinch the ends together and take the outside braid and bring it to the inside, and then the other outside braid and bring it to the inside. So always just bringing the outside one to the middle. Then we're gonna pinch the end, and then we're gonna fold the ends under, like so. And we just lift that up, like the little precious baby that it is. And just put that in there. Beautimous. Ungreased pan because it's non-stick. So I'm gonna cover this with a towel so it doesn't dry out. And I'm gonna go put it in my little proofing box for an hour. And then we'll test. I'll show you how we test to make sure that it's done proofing. But basically we're looking for it to be at the, the top of the pan. You're like, oh, okay, this looks like it's big enough. You press your finger into the dough. If it bounces back all the way, that means that the gluten is still too tight and it needs longer to proof. But if it bounces back very slowly or stays, then it's ready. And I actually didn't think this was ready, but it might be. Brush the egg wash on. Egg wash is important. It's just 1 egg whisked together with 1 tablespoon of water. If you don't put the egg wash on it, it won't get that golden shine. Depending on what you're baking and how big it is, it's going to bake at different times, right? So some things that are smaller might bake as fast as 20 minutes, or they might take up to 40 minutes. So just keep an eye on your bread. When it starts getting to be golden brown, you want to check the internal temperature. It's done between 180 and 190 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm also doing a pull apart loaf where it's like you basically form the pieces into little rolls and then you put them side by side in a loaf pan so that they pull apart after they're done baking. So good. All right, this time we want 2-ounce pieces of dough and we want 8. First and foremost, get all of your ends on the bottom and roll them smooth. I actually find making bread very relaxing. So what this is going to do is it's going to look like a braided loaf at the end, but it's going to pull apart like pull apart bread. It's gonna be really, it's yummy. We're gonna cover that and let that proof to double. Once it's doubled and you can press your finger into it without the dough bouncing back, it's ready to bake. Go ahead and put some egg wash on top and bake at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for 25 to 35 minutes or until it's golden brown on top. Ooh, look how beautiful. We did one version where we prepped it 24 hours in advance, made the dough, let it rest, chilled it overnight, and saw how that turned out. And then we did one where we only chilled it for an hour to see what the differences were. This one was only chilled for 2 hours. It rose up a little sporadically. The dough is a little bit softer. It's a little bit rougher to handle, but ultimately puffed up very nicely. So this one was rested for 24 hours in the refrigerator before it baked up. So it's a little bit more consistent results, a little bit more even rise, and it's probably just because the gluten had more time to relax. And honestly, the main difference was that the dough was a little bit stickier and wetter, but it was not impossible to handle. Now imagine a sandwich. I'm so hungry. It has so much flavor. All right, that's a 2-hour ferment. Literally tastes the same. I could not tell you the difference between these two pieces at all. Now let's try some of this pull apart loaf. Ooh, it's so soft. The warm is the best. You're gonna think I'm crazy, but this almost tastes like ice cream. It tastes like custard, but like bread. It's like creamy, but eggy, but I don't know what's happening in my mouth. My official recommendation is to eat this literally 5 minutes out of the oven. So that's it, guys. That's everything you ever needed to know about making homemade brioche bread. Hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I have more bread recipes right here, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.